Well, good morning and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dave Ripplinger. I'm on the faculty in the Department of Agribusiness and Applied Economics at NDSU. I'm going to serve as moderator today for a presentation by Dr. Jeremy Jackson. Just a little bit of a heads up of how it's going to go, a presentation and then Q&A afterwards. For those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom, we're going to be, or are, and have used the Q&A feature before, there is a box that you can check and go ahead and ask questions anytime during the presentation, and then I'll moderate those afterwards. If you have any other questions, you can also use the chat to contact us about any technical issues you might have. But with that, I'd just like to turn it over to Dr. Jackson for his webinar today.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ripplinger, for helping us put this together. You've definitely gone above and beyond what we would expect from you, so thank you so much for helping us out. So today, what I'm going to do is go over the special report that our center produced on the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on the North Dakota economy. And as I do that, I always like to start off a talk that I do with an outline so you kind of know what to expect. So I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about the methodology behind the report that we've produced. Also talk a little bit about data. Then we'll get into probably what you're most interested in is actually looking at the forecast that we have. And at the end, I'm going to talk about what makes me lose sleep at night. So I also want to be sure that I acknowledge those who have made contributions. While the model that the forecast is based upon is my work, the report itself had a lot of work done by a number of individuals. So at the center, Dr. Ryan Yonk helps us. He is our undergraduate program director, and Callie Christensen is our communication specialist, and she does a lot of work editing behind the scenes. And we also have a number of student employees that work with us as research fellows, in particular Cole Nichols and Kobe Warzeka. Were both instrumental in putting our reports together. And of course, thank you again to David Ripplinger and NDSU Extension for helping us in supporting this webinar production. So with that, we'll just get into a little bit about the methodology that I used in producing the forecasts that are in the report. And forecasting always makes use of past data to predict future trends in data. And as I conducted this analysis, I wanted to try to use just as much data as possible. And what I mean by that is I didn't want the assumptions of me as a personal influencer on the forecast. So we were using a method that is very data-driven and doesn't make reliance on theoretical assumptions by me. In our special report, though, I did have to make several assumptions in order to look at the effect of the pandemic. And so we made some assumptions about what the unemployment rate might be. And of course, we also took into account what was happening and what we thought might happen with oil prices. So we'll get into those details a bit more a little bit later. But also, when talking about forecasting and methodology, I think if you've read the report and seen some of the news accounts, you'll see that I'm always careful to make this point that all forecasts, including this forecast, are always wrong, and especially when you look at the point estimates. So as you hear me talk about our forecast, I'm not usually going to refer to a specific estimate of how much something is going to move. Forecasts provide us information, but they're not perfect. And so if all forecasts are wrong, why do we do them? Well, as I was just alluding to, even though it's going to be wrong, it still provides us with useful information. Forecasts reveal trends and patterns that you wouldn't be able to see if you just eyeballed the data, because they're able to get into some very deep correlations and patterns that are in the data. And they can also, and I think that's really the real benefit of this COVID-19 report, is that it allows us to look at some hypothetical scenarios. So the forecast does allow us to look at some what ifs. And when they're done properly, forecasts can give us information about what type of risks we might be subject to and give us more information about the range, the full range of possible outcomes. So now for some specifics. The forecast model itself, sorry for including some technical language here, but it uses what's known as a vector autoregressive model. We estimate a system of equations that includes lags of past values in an attempt to predict future values. And in our model, there are exactly 3 lags. So our model uses quarterly data. So we use the previous 3 quarters worth of data to predict what would happen in, say, the current quarter. The other thing to note is that in our VAR model, we're not estimating levels. So for instance, when we talk about the estimate of what GDP might be, usually we'll talk about the level of GDP. Well, the model itself is actually estimating the percentage change, the growth rate in GDP, and then we convert it back to a level. Another thing for you to be aware of is that VAR models have what we call endogenous variables. So those are variables that the model actually itself determines and computes, but it also has exogenous variables. So those are variables that aren't computed by the model, but the model takes them in as an input. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of the data is a little bit later. So the model that we use to forecast for the state of North Dakota is what I refer to as a nested VAR model. And there are actually 6 models inside of the, actually maybe there's 5 as I'm looking here. There are 6. There's 6 models. We have a model of the commodity markets. So we do take into account trends in oil, soy, wheat, and corn. We have a model of the national economy. The national economy, of course, would take in inputs from the commodity prices. Then under the national economy, we also have the state economy. So the state economy is influenced by changes that are happening in the national economy. And then inside of the state economy, we also have a separate model for Fargo, Grand Forks, and Bismarck. But in the special edition report, I've focused primarily on modeling the state economy and have, for the most part, ignored what happens in the 3 MSAs that enter into the model. So as I mentioned, we do have a overall economic outlook report that we produce, but we have this special report that I'm talking about today on the effect of COVID-19. And that produces a few things that are different for us. In particular, we're only just now beginning to receive the actual data from the post-COVID-19 world. So we actually released this report before the most recent reports of unemployment were released. So the national unemployment rate is now up to 14.9%. That wasn't a figure that we had when we produced this original report. And it's also good for you to know that for many of the data that are in the report and that are used by the model, there's a lag in terms of when the data is actually made available. And especially when we talk about things like GDP, many of those data points are still from 2019. So we don't even have 2020 Q1 or Q2 numbers yet. So the Economic Outlook Report for the second quarter of 2020 had no post-COVID-19 data available at all. And so how did we model the effect of COVID-19? So the model actually looks at what I call an external effect of COVID-19 onto North Dakota. That is, we all know that businesses in North Dakota shut down. That doesn't specifically enter into the model. So what does enter into the model was the fact that oil prices plunged. So we went from, at the beginning of the year, West Texas Intermediate was at about $50 a barrel. First quarter dips down to more like $40 a barrel. And then we're probably all pretty familiar with the high volatility that oil prices had in recent weeks, even taking a turn to negative. So we look at the effect of the plunging oil price on North Dakota, but also we're looking at the skyrocketing national unemployment. And both of these two factors are things that are external to the state of North Dakota. So we look at them as something happening out in the world, and we want to see the effect that they would have then on North Dakota's economic variables. Part of what that means to me as a modeler is that I think that some of the results that we have in our report might actually possibly be a little bit of underestimates of the effect. If we think about the actual direct effect, in addition to the external effect, the magnitude could potentially be even a little bit larger. So I want to talk just now a little bit about the data that we use, even though I've been talking about a few things. And as I do that, I've been mentioning this economic outlook report. I want to make sure that I help you know where to find that economic outlook report. So the link to the report is right here on your screen, and I'll just click it and bring this into view. This is actually the website of the center that I direct, the Center for the Study of Public Choice and Private Enterprise. And we are currently in the page for the economic outlook. And from here, you can see there's both the standard economic outlook report that we're actually going to produce on a quarterly basis going forward. And there's also a link that you can get the full special edition report that we're talking about today. There's also a link to the technical appendix. And I bring this up because it's in this technical appendix that we actually list all of the variables that enter into the model, and we list both the exogenous variables and the endogenous variables. So in the national model, you can see there's quite a large set of endogenous variables, and for the national model, the West Texas Intermediate price is the only exogenous variable. And then we have state variables. I'm not going to go through each of these. I just want to make you aware of where you can find all of these specifics of the data that's used in the model. So as I mentioned, we're producing this quarterly report, and we want to continue doing that. Because of that, we actually, in creating the model, the data that we use is all data that's regularly updated and accessible and available through what's called the Federal Reserve Economic Data database, which is hosted by the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. We call it FRED. There's a link to that here as well. I'll pull that up. It's having a little bit of oh, there it goes. This is what FRED looks like. You can look up any number of data points on here. Our model uses only data from FRED because it's so readily available that as we produce this quarterly report, we can keep up with all of the data that comes in. So as I said, why do we only use data that's available on FRED? Well, we're not a full service economic forecasting shop. This is something that we're producing as a service to our state to try to produce information that's usable. But this report is something that we are not receiving any funding to do or being compensated for. So we want to do this in a way that we can reproduce the report, like I said, on a quarterly basis on into the future. And FRED is updated with the most up-to-date and reliable economic data on a continuous basis. That being said, I do know that the state of North Dakota uses a forecast model from Moody's. to forecast many of its internal workings. And our model is very different from that done by Moody's. And Moody's likely has access to data that is not publicly available on the FRED database. So I don't want you to view our model as producing the exact same thing that Moody's does. Our model is what I call a complement. That is, it's something that can be used along with Moody's to provide just different type of information and a different perspective. So I've already shared with you the technical appendix. Let's now take a look at the actual forecast numbers. And many of you may have already seen the report, but many of you may not have. But you can go access the report. I'm not really going to say too much here that's not in the actual report itself. As I mentioned previously, the way that we estimate the effect of COVID-19 on the state of North Dakota was to look at what's happening to the price of crude oil and looking at several different scenarios, okay? So we looked at what would happen if the price of crude oil were to be $40 a barrel, $25 a barrel, $15 per barrel, and $5 per barrel. And actually, when I was first producing this, I thought that looking at what happens with the $5 per barrel price of West Texas Intermediate was crazy. And then shortly thereafter, the price was negative $35 per barrel. Currently, the price is hovering around $33 per barrel, so we did have some recovery in prices. But some of the news coming out just today is that the price of oil is going down as China has revised many of its estimates of how their economy is working. And you can see here graphically, what we're showing is where the price of crude was in 2021 Q1. Under our baseline scenario, the price basically was forecast to hold pretty constant. So we're comparing everything to this baseline, but then we have our $40, which is the green line, our $25, which is the red line, $15, which is this blue line, and then this maroon line is 5. And we're also looking at what happens with various levels of the unemployment rate. So in our scenarios, we looked at what would happen if the unemployment rate were 13%, 20%, or 30%. And we held that constant at that level for from the second quarter of 2020, which we're currently in, basically on into the first quarter of 2021. And so you can see what those different unemployment scenarios look like in this graph. In total, we had a number, 13 total scenarios that we looked at throughout the analysis. So here's what we predicted and what the forecast says in terms of national outcomes and national outlook. So in the baseline, basically we were going to hold steady at a nice little rate of growth. In our model, of course, then the GDP was predicted to fall. And this is with this first panel is what would happen under the 13% unemployment rate. Each of these lines represents a different price for West Texas Intermediate. And then in this panel, we have a 20% unemployment rate. And in the final panel on the bottom, what would happen with a 30% unemployment rate. And as you would expect, national GDP is falling. One of the interesting things about the national economy is that it actually does better with low oil prices, right? It's a major cost of industry. When the major cost of industry is lower, traditionally, the national economy performs better. Of course, the state of North Dakota has a very different relationship with the price of oil, which we'll see now on this slide. All of the data here, so there's 5 different graphs on this one page, give us what would happen with a 13% national unemployment rate. And our gross state product, which is the most like GDP, but for the state of North Dakota, is in this fourth panel. And you can see the $40 price is actually the highest prediction for the forecast, whereas the $5 price of oil is the lowest prediction. And in this graph, gross domestic product could fall by potentially as little as 5% if we're looking at the $40 price of oil, but it could fall by as much as even 50% if we're looking at what would happen with the $5 price of oil. So a very wide range depending upon what the price of oil might actually do. We also have estimates here on the unemployment rate. It shouldn't be surprising, especially as unemployment numbers come in. It turns out that the most up-to-date state unemployment levels haven't been released yet, but they should be being released fairly soon. But the model is predicting that the unemployment rates in North Dakota are going to go up. Total wages and salaries are going to fall. And of course, with that $5 oil price, the fall could be substantial. And all of these things also have an influence on total tax collections in the state. So it's not surprising, given that much of our tax dollars depend upon oil royalties, and we see much less production happening, and what production is happening at a very low value. But those oil royalties, of course, feed into income that gets also, so we have the extraction taxes that the state gets, but then people make an income off their royalties, which feeds into income tax revenue for the state. But then, of course, total economic activity in terms of sales tax is also much lower due to the pandemic as well. So total tax collections are predicted to fall and could fall quite substantially depending upon the trajectory of the price of oil. And as I mentioned, this set of projections was based upon a 13% national unemployment rate. With a 20% unemployment rate, I really like the way these slides kind of overlay each other, which kind of gives this nice little back and forth. But it's also useful to note, so I'm back to the 13% slide, that the axes are actually changing in their units. So while it looks like the unemployment rate doesn't change much, the axis changed. So unemployment rates are much higher under that 20% national unemployment rate scenario. And I'm not going to talk in detail about each of these scenarios. You can look at the report if you want some more specifics. And I'll also show you what happens at the 30% level. And I want to do my best to make sure that we save time for many of you to ask questions. I can try to think about what questions you might have regarding the report, but I want to make sure you have time to actually ask them. So if you're interested in getting some more detail on the actual values that you're looking at in these pictures, I encourage you to go to our website and get the report. There's some nice summaries of the overall trends that are contained in the report. I do want to mention, and in this last slide that I'm going to show of the forecast itself, this is looking again at what would happen with a 13% national unemployment rate. And again, we already know that currently the national unemployment rate's actually at about 14.9%, and is likely to be going up from there. And in this slide, we're actually holding or only looking at a crude oil price of $25. And you'll notice that these pictures, pardon me, have kind of a thick band around what would be a red line. Well, this red line is the forecast that was in our previous panel for the 13% national unemployment rate, specifically for the $25 crude price. But this band around that represents what we call a confidence interval. And this is a realization that what we're looking at is a statistical product, right? We don't, as economists, focus on this point estimate of where we think things would be. We often think about the full range of possibilities. And that confidence interval tells us that we're 90% confident that the forecast value, or that the actual value will fall inside of this 90% confidence interval. And notice that especially as you get out to the first quarter of 2022, the confidence intervals are quite wide. It's really, there's a lot of uncertainty involved in conducting any forecast. And I include this partly because we can't put these confidence intervals on those other graphs. They just become too cumbersome. But this shows you that the range of possibilities under one scenario is very big. So the range of what could happen is quite big. The thing that I think is most shocking about our report is that it shows us that the range of the possibilities has, and if you notice most of these, I mean, look at total salaries and wages. The very top of that 90% confidence interval is kind of at a hold steady pattern. That tells us that we're really confident that total wages and salaries are going to fall. And for all of these, especially if we look at total tax collections, the 90% confidence interval almost lies entirely below this baseline. It gives us a pretty good confidence that total tax collections are going to fall, and they could fall by a very, very, very substantial amount. So with that, I want to go ahead and start concluding so that like I said, I want to have enough time for you to ask some questions. With what makes me lose sleep at night? Well, I have 2 kids at home, and they're afraid of the monsters under the bed. So what are my monsters under the bed? Well, as I just mentioned, the potential downside for the state of North Dakota is potentially really bad. Really bad is in potentially catastrophic. It doesn't mean that's where we're going to be. We don't know with certainty where we're going to be. But as a state, we need to be prepared for the realization that the possible outcomes include some really bad outcomes. And we need to be planning ahead to try to figure out how we can be best prepared for those potentially bad outcomes. The other things that I lose sleep about are a bit more personal for me as a researcher, in that I do a lot of research on the role of the social norms of social trust. So this is a very different thing to talk about than just a forecast. But it turns out that social trust, as something that an economist and a researcher would be interested in, is highly related to happiness for people, but also to things like economic growth. Our ability to conduct trade and exchange, to barter and conduct business with one another, is dependent upon me as a consumer trusting that the business that I'm giving money to is going to provide me with the products and services that it's promised. But I worry that as we have the types of effects that we're seeing and the types of increased regulation that's happening with COVID-19 might actually end up leading to lower amounts of social trust. Why do we regulate to begin with? We generally regulate because we don't trust somebody to do what we think is the right thing. We don't trust that people would wear a mask on their own, so we make it a rule that everybody has to. So we can rely on the rule and the regulation rather than on people being trustworthy themselves. I won't go into details, but this is actually a point of much of my research. I've been doing some research on the role, on the the relationship between social trust and regulation. I'll give you a picture. This green line is a trend line for regulation in the United States from 1970 through about 2017. Notice that regulation is pretty much steadily increasing. And then this red line that you see bouncing around a lot in the 1970s and early 80s is a measure of social trust in the United States. And one of the things that you'll notice, right, restrictions and regulations are going up. Social trust in the United States is trending down. We tend to replace trusting one another with regulating one another. So that's where I'm going to basically conclude. I do kind of want to end on a somewhat positive note. I think that a lot of us like to know, well, what can we do? And in terms of especially my research on social trust, I say it's best for us to not focus on the rules that we need to impose on others. Instead, you know, I tell my children about the golden rule all the time. Why don't we make sure that we ourselves behave in a manner that's trustworthy? And let's have faith that everybody else will behave in a manner that's trustworthy as well. And I do want to remind you that this is a product of the Center for the Study of Public Choice and Private Enterprise. We engage in research and educational programs to explore the institutions and policies that promote human flourishing. As I mentioned, we have that quarterly economic outlook report. I imagine that with the next quarter, which would start in July, that we will also be producing another special COVID-19 release. There are others in our center that are also doing good research on COVID-19. So again, here's our website. We have under our outreach, there's a link to COVID-19. And this will give you a link to all of the different pieces that the center has produced on the influence of COVID-19. And if any of you have students that you know of that are looking for opportunities and activities, the center supports students in a number of ways. We have reading groups every semester that participants receive a scholarship for working on. And we also employ research fellows that get to work on projects like this, but on many other projects as well. And with that, I'm going to be turning this back over to our moderator, Dr. Ripplinger. But I also want to mention that you can follow our center on a number of social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. You can also, if you have some questions that come out of this that you would like me to address, feel free to email me. My email address is jeremy.jackson@ndsu.edu. And as I said, back to you, Dave.
Great, thanks, Dr. Jackson. We have one question up on the board right now. Given the set of potential scenarios that you've laid out, what advice would you give to policymakers as they attempt to respond to the changing economic landscape?
So it's always a tough thing to turn something into a specific policy, and I don't think that that's what I'm going to mention. So I'm not going to give a specific. The overall thing that I think that we need to end with, and I mentioned this at the end of the presentation as well. We need to be prepared for potentially really bad possible outcomes. So as a policymaker, what would I do? I would try to have some contingent plans in place. What would we do if X happens? Let's have a plan in place so that we can respond quickly. Now, what the response should be, that's something that's not something I want to make a statement on what they should actually do. But the general lesson that I think is we need to be prepared for what could be some really bad outcomes. And of course, there's really no way for us to really predict where oil prices are going to be on into the future either. oil prices are subject to national and international markets. And it's also a part of the geopolitical balance, which is at the moment very difficult to make a prediction.
Another question, Jeremy. What does really, really bad look like?
Really, really bad is, and I can flip back to my graphs. Okay, so this is the slide with confidence intervals. So total wages and salaries were in the neighborhood of 250 million prior. If we look at this 90% confidence interval, okay, the bottom of that 90% confidence interval is going about as low as 5. So really, really, really bad. That's almost a complete collapse in wages and salaries. I mean, do I think that's going to happen? No. But the full range of what can happen is inside of these confidence intervals. Notice that the confidence interval includes things could be just fine, right? But the bulk of it lies below that. If we look at total tax collections, and again, focusing on the confidence interval, really, really bad has us, this is 0. So I'll go out, this is a very wide confidence interval, but very, very, very bad is, even here, this middle part here, that's a collapse of more than 50% in total tax collections in the first quarter of 2021.
Another question, what do you think about the impact of internalization of countries when it comes to trade and business as a result of the pandemic?
So much of our wealth as a country is based upon international trade. This is one of the fundamental lessons of economics. We have, we're all good at some things and bad at others. And when people specialize and produce one thing and then we trade and barter with one another, we're able to have more stuff. So the degree to which international trade is hampered, that's going to reduce my ability to buy really cheap stuff. And I like buying cheap stuff. But there are some other interesting things there as well, in that, especially for the state of North Dakota, we're in a different place than many other states in our country, in that we're a predominantly an exporting state. So this is one of the things that if you've heard me speak on the radio about this, that I've always mentioned, is that if you want our state's economy to recover, and I know that we do, okay, the impetus is usually on, well, we need to reopen our state, right? We need to get people back working. Well, part of the problem that we have as a state is that we're dependent upon other places being open for business. We need other places to be back in business so that they will demand and purchase the products that we as the state of North Dakota produce. And much of that is reliant upon international trade. So the collapse of European economies, Asian economies, those have a feedback effect in terms of the demand for the outputs that the state of North Dakota produces.
Right. Next question in a few parts. So how does the weak agricultural economy play into these forecasts? What are the scenarios if farm profit remains negative? And then what if U.S.-China relationships deteriorate?
So the forecast model itself does take into account forecasts on some of the commodity prices. It uses commodity price indices. And the scenarios that we looked at didn't look specifically at any of the the happenings in agricultural markets. But we do know that the especially when we think about income for the state and where income is coming from, a lot of it comes from the ag sector. And as the ag sector is reducing its income, that's going to feed back again into lowering our tax revenues. But specifically in terms of declining relations with China, I mean, that's obviously had a huge influence on the soy price that we've had. And I got to be careful when I have Dr. Ripplinger on that I don't try to make myself sound like any sort of an expert in what's happening in ag commodity markets, because that's somewhat out of my own research purview. But we need, as I mentioned, demand for what we produce in the state to be demanded by people outside of our state to buy it. And China represents what could be a big purchaser of our produce and product. So as those trade as we have trade restrictions or whatever that prevent us from conducting that trade, it's going to have an impact on our state's economy. But as I said, I don't want to, there's if you want to ask specifics about what's going to happen in commodity markets, I'm the wrong person to ask.
The next question, do these forecasts for North Dakota assume the population will remain the same?
So the population itself isn't a parameter that's inside of the model. What is in the model is unemployment rates, but also the workforce or the labor force. And it does predict that the labor force will decline. We could go back. So it predicts a decline in the labor force. Notice that we do have kind of a bit of a recovery predicted. So there's a decline, but then coming back. A lot of that depends on what happens. But in terms of population, I mean, one can only imagine, and I'll go back to here, if total tax revenues collapse, if total wages and salaries do collapse, gross state product collapses to these levels, I don't think that you probably need to be an economist to say that's probably going to produce people exiting the state. Now, that would be dependent upon people having someplace else to go where they could get a job.
Right. Next question. In addition to the impact of oil price decreases, and what is the impact of other commodity price decreases on the state's economy?
As I mentioned, our scenarios only looked at changes in the oil price, but our economy is highly dependent not only on oil prices, but on also all of the commodity prices. That's part of what makes our economy as a state react counter-cyclically to the national economy. And this is one of the interesting things about producing forecasts for the state of North Dakota. Generally, if the national economy is doing well in the forecast, then the state's economy is doing less well. The state tends to do well when the national economy is doing less well. But in terms of as I said previously, specifics about the commodity prices, your best person to talk to about what's going to happen with commodity prices is probably Frayne Olson. But our commodity prices are a main component, both of our, they're a big source of wages and income in the state. They are a main contributor to gross state product. And through both of those channels, they result in taxes in the form of taxes on income that's earned, but also on taxes on producers. And So lower commodity prices are going to have an effect on all of those things.
Right. What impact do you see the state's $33 million infusion into the Bakken having on the economy?
So is that question asking, I feel like there's maybe a detail missing.
Well, I'll give the individual a chance to add some additional detail, and we'll come back to it. What's the driving forecast for total wages increasing in the third quarter? Now, why do we see that?
So that gets into some nitty-gritty details, but it actually comes from some of the trends that we see in this national forecast too. So there is predicted this dip, but then potential recoveries. Okay, but to get into what's producing this overall, I mean, this little blip there. I mean, keep in mind that's this $40, right, oil price. Okay, so the going up, things go down, continue to go down if the oil price is low. So I'll go back to the national outlook. This uptick is happening the most with the low oil price. Okay, that's where the counter-cyclical relationship between the overall country and the state of North Dakota comes into play. The overall country experiences a recovery with this low $5 price, okay, which results in the state of North Dakota experiencing the opposite of a recovery, okay? So a lot of that uptick depends upon how much you have this growth happening actually in the overall economy. It can be difficult to tease out a specific reason why, partly due to the nature of the model. I showed you some of the variables that enter in. There's a lot of them, and they all enter into the model with 3 lags. So there's a lot of things happening all at once that lead to any one of these trends that are in the pictures.
Next question. Social trust seems to increase after disasters, people coming together to solve challenges. Is COVID a different type of disaster in that it makes people more suspicious?
So I think that's a great question. Part of what I think about too, and this is, this becomes personal for us all very quickly, but my wife needed to mail something very recently, and she actually needed to go to the post office to do this. And our post office here in downtown Fargo is also connected to a federal building, some federal offices. And so she walked into a post office in a federal building wearing a face mask. I mean, just the strange feeling of doing that, and the fact that nobody was really affected by it. But when you move around and interact with people and can't see their faces, how do I just think about how much do we trust each other when we can't even really see each other? One of the interesting things is that there have been some technological advances that have allowed us to trust complete strangers in ways that we wouldn't other have. But this is having big effects there as well. But if we think to like Uber, we're mostly taught growing up, right? Don't get into a car with a stranger. But Uber created this app that allowed you and a complete stranger to develop a type of a trust relationship that allowed an exchange to happen for you to get a ride. But we also see that things like Uber, of course, are collapsing and not doing that well at the moment. So there are certain ways, though, that technology can help us overcome this type of trust problem. But I do think that when we're told to social distance, it's really hard to develop and maintain that level of social trust. Trust is based upon interaction. And at the moment, we aren't interacting. And I actually, as I think back on the spring, am extremely, extremely grateful that we didn't have what could have been one of the worst floods that was predicted. I can't imagine what would have happened, where we would be now if we had to sandbag amidst a pandemic.
Next question. How does COVID uniquely impact the working class and lower class workers in North Dakota?
So one of the things that has become clear in many of the reports that are out there is that the pandemic and the shutdown has been most felt economically by those who are the least amongst us, the poorest. So, I think that's where we'll see some major impact in the state. It's those workers at the plants that get shut down. It's actually, to a large degree, it's those workers at the restaurants that are going to go, or that are going out of business and not reopening. Those are the places that it's felt the most. And employers are going to have to adapt. It's one thing to open up your business to customers. It's also another thing to make sure that your employees feel safe to come back to work. And those are both things that you'll need. You'll need your employees to feel safe. You'll need your customers to feel safe. Without those two things, it's going to be really hard to get the workforce back to work.
Right. And then what might be our last question, unless any more come up, is there a large difference in the economy between Eastern North Dakota and Western North Dakota?
So yes, there's a very large difference. With this special report, I've focused mostly on estimates for the state. But even given the types of data that I have available to me, the MSAs that we look at, are Fargo, Bismarck, and Grand Forks. So Bismarck is as far west as what's included in the model, because that's, MSAs as a statistical unit are where data is most available. But yes, the western part of the state, as most of us all know, is the most heavily reliant on oil. And this model took into account West Texas Intermediate. Partly, that's not the same price that we get for the oil produced in the Bakken region out in western North Dakota. But it's the price that's most readily available and most readily traded, and does give us some information about overall trends in oil prices. But yes, that's going to have a huge impact potentially on western North Dakota. And as we've seen too, the changes in access to supply chains for agricultural products is having a big impact. And the western portion of the state is much more heavily reliant on other agricultural outputs than are, say, some of the other city centers that have different industries.
Great. I think that's our last question. Is there the individual who asked the question about the infusion of the Bakken had to step out, although we can follow up with him afterwards if you'd like. Any last remarks that you'd like to make, Dr. Jackson?
Well, I just want to thank you all for coming in and joining us on a Friday morning. This is the first time that we've ever hosted a webinar. So if you have some feedback you'd like to share, would be glad to hear from you. And if you have some questions that are lingering that I wasn't able to answer while I'm on the hot seat, feel free. I've got my email address back up on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me via email, and also, come back to our website and take a look when we produce that next quarterly report that'll be coming out in July. It'll be really interesting and fascinating to see what happens with much of the data that is coming out for this current quarter. So I think it'll be an equally interesting report as this one.
Great, thank you. And I just want to thank Dr. Jackson again for presenting the webinar and first of all for writing the report and putting all the work into developing the model. And then for all the attendees who were able to participate today, I wish everybody a safe and enjoyable Memorial Day weekend. Thanks.